Well, the president started a task force on victims of crime, which I had the honor to chair, and we went around the country and hold hearings in 6 states. And we got a lot of information. We wrote a report, gave it to the president. He really loved it. He said, I want you to implement these recommendations, and then he made me Assistant Attorney General to do that. Then one of those recommendations was, in essence, creating an office for victims of crime. So I had the honor of being able to create that and get it started, which was a labor of love. And it was also kind of special because it was really holding true to requests and needs of the victims, that it was not going to just be a task force to put on a shelf later. It really was going to be a living document.
Prior to the administration introducing the bill, and this was seen as heresy by people at OMB and by conservatives who said we don't want to create another government entitlement program. The fact that the Reagan administration would be proposing what would be seen as another federal assistance program was totally heresy.
And I had to brief the cabinet a couple of times. You know, I've been in court a long time, but you have to brief the cabinet of the United States. I was so nervous. All I kept thinking is there's only one foreman, it's the president. That's all I have to focus on. And I was briefing the cabinet to get the Victims of Crime Act passed and the Crime Control Act. And the issue that came up, which I love, was Dave Stockman at the time was saying, Mr. President, this is an entitlement. This is an entitlement. And I was going to answer, and then the president said, well, wait a minute, Dave. Are you saying that victims get themselves bashed over the head, go to the hospital and get sewn up so they can get money? Are you saying that? And I thought, I don't have to say anything more. The president's got it. And so he gave the okay for, among a lot of people wanting a lot of different things, he gave the okay to get the Victims of Crime Act.
I have vivid memories of those meetings where I was dragged along as basically the spare tire for Lois, who was the entire vehicle, moving through those corridors. And she was very persuasive, and she came at the proposal in a way that they were not used to people dealing with in those days. It was very passionate, very personal, very direct, and it really, without her, this legislation would have never passed.
The vision I had in mind were, the people who gather around the table trying to, do bake sales to sustain their services. And I remember hearing Lois Harrington talking about we wanted to provide them so they didn't have to worry from year to year how they were going to sustain their services. In October of '84, when the legislation was on the floor of the Senate, NOVA convened a group of people, about 20 or so, from various states, for a multi-day session in the Airlie Foundation in Virginia. And we were all camped out there in bunks and it was raining and foggy, and we would be huddled in a room, and we keep getting telephone reports as to what was going on in the Senate, and we would try to feed back things, and I think there's several items of VOCA that came out of that session that was significant. One was, at the time, VOCA, as it was drafted at that time, really was intended, and I think this was the vision of the administration, and was really meant to sustain the existing programs.
People talked about putting excise taxes on guns at the time. They talked about, this was a real controversial one the NRA didn't like, they talked about putting a fee on hunting ranges or hunting clubs or whatever to fund it. Steve Doreen or John Stein can tell you who came up with the idea to basically tax offenders. But it was a really creative idea to make those who commit crimes pay for it.
There's no question that Marlene, Nova, and others had urged the task force to talk about federal funding of victim rights, victim services, victim compensation. But it was their invention to say, let's find the money out of federal criminal fines.
And some of the early drafts of the legislation actually would have limited funding to existing programs. And I think the theory was there were other funding sources that would start up new programs, and VOCA would sustain them.
And so VOCA comes along and it says this is to keep those old programs first from going down, because if they go down, we have nothing. and then to build new. And we were able to kind of say, okay, how do we create policies and procedures to fund programs that may be kind of in their infancy stage and make that easy?
Senator Specter went to the floor of the Senate and proposed an amendment that no one objected to, which he dreamed up without anyone lobbying him. And one that said that in the victim assistance grants, priority should be given to helping victims of domestic violence, child abuse, and sexual assault. And we screamed as soon as he did it. We kept saying over and over and over again, we have no objections to who is on that list. It's the people not on that list that we think need to be taken care of.
As part of my graduate studies, I did an internship when Iowa received their first VOCA grant. And so as an intern in 1985, I was tasked with setting up the VOCA Victim Assistance Grant Program. And back then, nobody was really very interested in state government with the VOCA program because the dollar amounts were so low. There was no administrative money, and no agency or program wanted to take on that responsibility. So it was delegated down to me as an intern. And after having spent 6 months setting up the process for the VOCA grants, I graduated, got my master's degree, and subsequent to that, they moved the VOCA program to another agency because the first agency no longer was interested in housing it.
Well, I can tell you the impact right away because, shortly after that, I worked as a consultant to OVC in doing their first report to Congress. And so was really able to take a look nationally as to what VOCA did. And on the compensation side, and compensation was an easier program to measure at the time, it really created an impetus far beyond the dollars that it provided to the states.
And it's there. And, you got VOCA, you got federal monies. It's getting institutionalized, even in the community social services, where it's not just, well, that's a nice thing over there, but now it's an integrated part to the whole social service structure at the local community.
I can recall as a young policeman when you got a call for a rape victim or somebody who was the victim of an assault. I can recall that we would put them in the ambulance and send them off to the hospital. A few weeks later, sometimes 3 or 4, or maybe 5 weeks later, they'd get a bill from the ambulance company for the transportation. They'd also get a bill from the hospital for the, quote, treatment, which in some cases was what amounted to a rape kit.
I think what changed the biggest piece of the victims' rights movement was in the 80s. And of course, 1984, domestic violence and sexual assault, our funding came from VOCA and HHS under the Prevention, Health, and Human Services Block Grant and Family Violence Prevention and Services Act. And they were the principal funding sources for us. Before then, we got donations, literally got donations.
I do know that one of the immediate impacts was in some states that had no victim services at all. And I think of Arizona, for example. I remember surveying the states, and the response from states like Arizona was, we wouldn't have anything in our state if it weren't for VOCA. Because, again, it was not only the federal money, it was not only that financial resource, it was identifying people in the state, it was the political recognition of victim services.
You have to look back to VOCA. Just having a stable funding base that victim service programs, that state programs, state compensation programs can rely upon from year to year to support what they're doing is the most important thing, because that's where the services are being provided. That's how we're building a professionalized victim advocacy workforce. And without that, none of this is really possible.
We have the Victims of Crime Act today, and that's great. It is probably one of the best accomplishments of the field to establish that as a piece of legislation. But it seems like it's always in jeopardy. It's not in jeopardy of repeal, but the fund that is set up through the Victims of Crime Act is always in jeopardy of being raided. And that's at the federal level.
We have to keep the programs going that are there. We have to create new ones. We have to make more programs to reach more victims, because they're certainly not all being reached, and there's not enough to go around. There's just not enough people in those programs to help all the victims that we see. I don't see all that many victim advocates in my court, and I'm just a stickler about it. But I think that it is still very important, and the thing that tickles me a little bit is when we created this, and getting this fund was so hard. You have to understand, you know, this was a time that people were concerned, and I mentioned earlier about everyone thought this was an entitlement, and President Reagan, thank God, thought it wasn't and was able to identify that. But when we put the cap at $100 million, we thought, wow, what a lot of money that is. They'll never reach it.
And I remember asking the question, well, how much money did people anticipate would be coming into the fund when they were working on this? And people said no one had any idea. And what I remember reading years later about Daiwa Bank having to deposit, I think it was over $300 million in one fell swoop into the fund, I thought, boy, there's just no limit to what, not that there's unlimited money, but the potential is so great for what this money can do for crime victims.
We went from about 200 million to over 500 million when I was OVC director. But still, there was not a domestic violence shelter in every community. Most disabled crime victims had nowhere to go. There were very few places that women and men of different cultures could go to have comprehensive care and treatment. We were missing so much, and to cap a fund when the need is so great and has not been fulfilled, to me, is a big mistake, and that's a continuing fight.
It's one thing to have an ability under the law to collect the fines and collect them into a crime victims fund. It's another to get prosecutors, U.S. attorneys' offices, the whole correction system to actually collect them. And if you don't ask for those fines, the judges aren't going to order them necessarily on the natural. And these fines are helping to support victims programs. And then that led to a very steady but demonstrable increase in fine collections, which then not only provided more funding to the field, but also provided more funding to OVC to then take a leadership role in providing more training opportunities to the field to do more outreach on victims' rights.
Try not to get discouraged, because there are more roadblocks than there are open pathways in assisting victims, and you have to be in it for the long haul. Understand that to help an individual victim from the point of the time a crime occurs is probably, if you're going to be there for that victim through the issues related to that case and that victimization, it's probably going to be years.
We in the victim service field, and those who are in the victim service field, need to stop thinking that we have all the answers, and every now and then go out and do a reality check. Go out and talk to the people that we serve and find out whether or not what we're doing is really making a difference for them and making them happy.
Whoever's in the field, whether it's a police officer, a prosecutor, or a counselor, really listen to what crime victims are going through even today. Because what they're going through is probably not just their individual experience. You can probably magnify it by 100 or even 1,000. And if there are problems that you identify from that one crime victim, become an activist, turn it into public policy, go out and change a law, go visit the chief district attorney or the chief judge and complain. You know, turn it into a policy or a program or a law and make a difference for others.
My vision is that this just continues to grow until it's a part of what we are, and it's not something that's new or controversial. It's just a part of the way we take care of people. And you know, victims are an important part of our communities, and you know, the better job we do taking care of them, the healthier our communities are going to be.
Keep fighting. Keep fighting. It's important. There are so many things, as I said before, that are in law but are not really happening. Be vigilant. Find out what's going on in your community. The court watches are wonderful. Have people do court watches. They were very instrumental in changing behavior when people sat in court and reported what they saw. Be as supportive as you can of the victims groups in your community. But keep the fight, because when we slack off, when we think it's done, when we go off to something we think is more important, it all slips back. It's just human nature.